I am Ben Rose. I am the Recovery and Mitigation Section Chief for the Vermont Division of Emergency Management. And I'm happy to be with you today. Um, our assignment was to the Recovery and Mitigation Section for today was to cover the, quote, interface with FEMA to deliver federal disaster recovery and funding available for communities to reduce their future flood risk. So I'm going to cover recovery, and then I'm going to hand off to Stephanie Smith, our State Hazard Mitigation Officer. And that means that, and we have 10 minutes each. So here is federal disaster recovery funding in 9 minutes. The first thing to say is that there are two major flavors of FEMA disaster recovery assistance. The first one is called PA, public assistance, and we'll talk a lot about what that covers and who it is for. It is not for individuals. The other flavor is individual assistance, and Jason Goslin is our state individual assistance officer and the person to talk about individual assistance, or IA. Vermont really qualifies for IA. We had individual assistance in spring 2011, again in August 2011 with Tropical Storm Irene, and of course in July 2023. And IA is grants directly from FEMA to individual flood survivors. Public assistance, in contrast, covers public infrastructure. Now, typically, when we have a gravel road disaster, as we average about one a year, it's mostly local road damage, but it also covers damage to public buildings, ball fields, public utilities, water and wastewater facilities. Typically, the applicants, the eligible sub-recipients, if you will, for public assistance are municipalities and qualifying nonprofit entities, PNPs in FEMA parlance, entities that provide essential services, as well as state agencies. In order to qualify for a major public assistance federal disaster, we have to hit some thresholds. The first one is that there has to be statewide damage, and these numbers increase each year with cost of living. So for federal fiscal year 24, we have to have $1.14 million of statewide damage, and it has to be in counties which individually hit a threshold of $4.60 per capita times the US 2020 census. And so we have a chart of what the thresholds are for the individual counties. Here's the process, and it is a complicated process, and it's hard to do this in 9 minutes, but boom, we have a disaster event in the upper left of the screen. The first thing that happens is that Vermont Emergency Management typically reaches out through the regional planning commissions to local emergency management directors and asks the regional planning commissions to compile what we call local liaison reporting. That gives us situational awareness on what different towns are dealing with. We then feed the data of towns that have had significant impacts to the Agency of Transportation, and they're typically also in contact with road foremen and so forth on their own. They use a tool called Survey 123 to validate the damages and put cost estimates on put cost estimates around the damages that are reported. We call that the preliminary damage assessment. And then based on that, we make a request to FEMA for a joint preliminary damage assessment. And for example, for the December 18th and 19th, 2023 flood, as I record this on January 19th, 2024, we are doing joint preliminary damage assessment with FEMA in 11 counties to see if we will hit the thresholds. Once FEMA validates the damages that we have submitted, we roll those into a request which comes from the governor to the president via FEMA. And then weeks later, typically, we will get a major disaster declaration request. And that's the beginning of the process. We then schedule applicant briefings in the impacted counties, and the process begins. And then the process looks like this. From the declaration, we have applicant briefings. Each entity that had damages in the eligible counties submits a request for public assistance. It's a one-page form that is filled out through the FEMA grants portal, which is the FEMA software program, sort of like TurboTax for disasters. And then FEMA assigns a person to schedule an exploratory call and a recovery scoping meeting with each eligible entity, and project formulation begins. The state reviews the projects, and then the money is obligated by FEMA for the projects that are awarded to the Department of Public Safety. We are the grantee agency, so the money flows from FEMA to DPS, and we make subgrants to the subgrantees, also known as recipients, also known as your town, which means that your town is receiving the money from DPS as the pass-through recipient entity, and it's under the terms of a subgrant agreement from DPS to the community. And of course, that has all the federal requirements, it has all the state audit requirements. There's a lot of paperwork, and it's a complicated program, and you have to pay attention. And there's more about that, which we cover in applicant briefings. Something to know is that typically public assistance covers 75%, the federal share of the eligible costs. And the state covers a portion of the non-federal share through a state program called the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, or ERAF, if you will. If you may know all about ERAF. If you don't know about it, you can check your town's ERAF status and the percentage of non-federal share covered for your town at this website. It's the Flood Ready website. It's maintained by Agency of Natural Resources. It was built with a hazard mitigation grant years ago, and it's a great resource. You can check on your town's status on the various ERAF criteria. I don't have time to go into the ERAF criteria here, but in a nutshell, the minimum state share is 30% of the non-federal share. If you do 4 things, you get a 50-50 split with the state, and 50% of the non-federal share is covered by the state. Those 4 things are to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, have up-to-date local transportation standards, have a local emergency management plan, which you're required to do and submit annually anyhow. And the hardest one is to have a local hazard mitigation plan, which is FEMA approved. And we can work with you on that and provide you with funding if you don't have one, or if your 5-year plan is expiring. And then for bonus points, if you do a 5th thing, which is work with ANR on river corridor protection standards, you can qualify for 70% of the non-federal share covered by the state. That's ERAF in 1 minute. FEMA public assistance is complicated. There are basically 4 layers of eligibility. You read this chart from the bottom up. The first question FEMA asks is, are you an eligible applicant? And that's what the request for public assistance form determines. You say, we are a nonprofit. They say, show us your charter. If you're a municipality, it's pretty easy. They say, give us your number and your address and your points of contact. And then the next layer is, well, is the facility eligible? You have to be, whoa, I'm advancing too fast, sorry. Getting a preview. If the facility is your financial responsibility and you can demonstrate that you maintain it and maintained it before the disaster, then it should be an eligible facility. Is the work you're doing there eligible? Well, that will depend on what you're trying to do. It has to be associated with damage from the event. It has to have occurred during the incident period. And lastly, it has to be cost reasonable. Typically, when people run into problems with FEMA, this is hair trigger, it's because of procurement problems. You have to demonstrate to FEMA that the work is cost reasonable and that it was properly procured under 2 CFR. There are whole courses about that. Bottom line is follow your procurement policy and you should be okay. And there are provisions for exigent procurement when you're dealing with the immediate aftermath of a flood, for example. Uh, Public assistance has lots of interesting features, and every disaster is an opportunity to do things there'll never be a better time to do than right after a disaster. For example, you can do an improved project, which means we're rebuilding this stretch of road, and while we're doing it, we want to uh, improve pedestrian access. We want to add a bike lane. We want to go above and beyond putting it right back the way it was. FEMA will allow you to essentially add on and do a separate column of work that they're not paying for, but at the same time that you're mobilized to do the FEMA eligible work. Alternatively, you can do what's called an alternate project. That's doing something completely different from what was the damage. It's not replacing it. After Irene, we had a town that had some little used tennis courts, and instead of taking the FEMA funding to replace those damaged tennis courts, they used the money to do an alternate project, which was to put sidewalks in their downtown. That is possible. You may have a road that goes to one house and there's another way in and out, and there may be a better use of the eligible funds than to replace that particular stretch of road. You might want to throw up a road and turn it into a trail. Every disaster is an opportunity. And every disaster repair is an opportunity to do hazard mitigation, which is part of the PA funding. Hazard mitigation comes in two flavors, what we call 406, which is project specific. That is to say, we're going to upsize this culvert, not just to the codes and standards of your local transportation standards and the state general stream alteration permit, but we're going to do something beyond that. We're going to add head walls and riprap to make the drainage structure more resilient, for example. That's 406. It's project specific. And whenever FEMA is in town for PA, every town should be saying, we want 406 hazard mitigation to make our repairs more resilient. And the other flavor is 404. It's section 404 of the Stafford Act. And it's a whole separate grant program called the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP. And it is a program that is, again, run through the state. Stephanie Smith will cover this, but it's based on 15 cents for every dollar of PA becomes available to the state to make HMGP grants. And so for the July 2023 storm, we're looking at upwards of $70 million available to do hazard mitigation projects statewide. A lot of that is going to go to buyouts of flood-prone structures, but there is this huge window of opportunity to make our communities more resilient by using the hazard mitigation funding that's currently available. And I think at this point, I will stop and hand it off to Stephanie. If you have questions about public assistance, as you should, you can always reach out to me. You can always reach out to Kim Kanarecki, who's our state public assistance officer. Oops. Um, and we stole Kim from FEMA about a decade ago, and we're fortunate to have her. She knows PA like you wouldn't believe. And lastly, if you have questions that are specific to the July 2023 flooding, we have this special inbox set up. We have a contractor, Guidehouse, who is a great partner, and they are averaging about one business day in responding to inquiries to the ADM.2023 floods at Vermont.gov inbox. And I now yield to Stephanie. Thank you.